Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and specifically to the World of Tanks Sandbox test server. Wow, we've been experiencing a lot of tests recently, but none more dramatic than this. Wargaming just slipped the World of Tanks Sandbox test server featuring huge self-propelled gun changes right in the middle of the black market hysteria. Now that that's all calmed down, I've managed to collect my thoughts and I'm going to be presenting to you my opinion about the massive changes that there are to self-propelled guns, and also specifically how you can counter self-propelled guns that Wargaming are trialing out on the Sandbox test server. So at the start of the video, as always, I need to clarify just what a Sandbox test server is. It's where Wargaming go and test out imaginative ideas about what they think. They're suggesting what they think should go into the game, and then it's up to the player base to give their opinion and their feedback back to Wargaming to let them know whether their changes that they think would be good to go into the game. Now, quite often what Wargaming want World of Tanks to become and what the player base feel it should become are two separate things. And so if you feel strongly about these self-propelled gun changes, as I'm sure a lot of the community are going to, then either go on the forums, leave your feedback there, or better still, go and actually participate on the Sandbox test server, which I believe is going to be open until next Tuesday. Play a few games, see what you think, and if you play on the Sandbox test server, then later on in the week you're going to have a questionnaire pop up in the regular client where you'll be able to deliver your explicit feedback. Or if you want an easier way of doing it, just put in the comments down below. I'm pretty sure Wargaming are taking note of what is likely to become a very interesting read down there. So firstly, let me give you my opinion on what self-propelled gun class currently is. Now, it's very tricky for me to have an objective opinion about self-propelled guns because I quite often find myself on the receiving end of them. For many years before the anonymizer was put into the game, there was XVM statistics available for everyone, and I kind of flashed out like a big pink pinata for the enemy self-propelled guns to go and have some fun with, right? Also, people would see my nickname and they would be thinking, oh yeah, I'm gonna go and just shoot QuickyBaby all day if that's what I have to do, because that's more fun than actually trying to play properly and win the game, right? Probably kind of helped out my win ratio a little bit. Didn't help my statistics, but at least it was really good if you were on my team. All of the heavy tanks were probably thinking, oh, why another self-propelled gun shooting at me? Look, I'm exaggerating. I'm exaggerating a lot, but there was definitely still basis for what I was suggesting. What I'm trying to say is it was very hard for me to have an objective opinion about artillery, and that's why you'll know for the first, I'd say, 5 years of me playing World of Tanks, I absolutely despised them. I felt like they were there just to prevent me from winning games, and they were there with no ability for me to be able to fight back against. And yeah, that's still the case. When the anonymizer went into the game, and when I finally was able to experience what it was like for everybody to play against self-propelled guns, I realized that they're still bad. It's just they weren't nearly as oppressive as they were when I felt like I was flashing up like a big pinata. And I think really that is the problem with self-propelled guns. That at the moment, you just feel kind of helpless. There's nothing that you can really do. Shells come in, absolutely splat you, and then afterwards, they're also going to stun you. And that's because artillery these days is very different to what artillery used to be. Back in the day, artillery hit far harder than they do now. Probably at least twice as much damage. But they didn't stun you. And also, they had a much smaller splash radius, and so if they missed you, their damage was significantly less. What we really found about artillery in the previous form, before they were, let's be honest, nerfed about 3 or 4 years ago, was that if they hit your tank directly, you were losing at least a third of the hit points, irrelevant of what tank you were in. You were taking 800, 900 damage from a T92 like this with their high explosive rounds. And also, if they fired armor-piercing rounds at you, I believe they were doing either 1,800 or 2,200 damage if that big 240mm caliber shell managed to pen your tank. Artillery was fearsome. They kind of conducted the battlefield, or at least the pace of it, from the rear guard in places where you couldn't really even get to them. And back then the game was a lot slower as well, so there weren't pesky tier 10 light tanks or wheeled vehicles that could get to them to be able to punish them heavily. Artillery developed this stigma attached as the most hated class because back then they were undoubtedly overpowered. Now, I really don't feel that artillery is overpowered. They're more just annoying. They're just really annoying to deal with. Sure, when you get into a game like Malinovka or Prokhorovka, sometimes even a single artillery can really make the difference in the battle. No more than, for example, a light tank could on a map like that if the light tank player is playing very well. And please, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments down below, but I feel that the community just hates artillery for all of the principles that they are and not because they're overpowered. And so I think that World of Tanks has got this really big issue. They've got a controversial class inside the game for which apparently 50% of players are maybe not only playing artillery, but they like to dabble and they like to occasionally play self-propelled guns, while the other 50% of the player base just hate them with a raw passion and they would love to see them not just nerfed, they would just love to see them removed from the game. And so this Sandbox test server is definitely going to be the most tricky one for Wargaming to get right. It's going to be some opinions on one end of the spectrum and opinions on the other end of the spectrum. And I think there's going to be very few moderate opinions right in the middle. Because over the years, no matter what Wargaming do to the self-propelled guns, they can nerf their damage, they can nerf their utility, they can nerf the rate of fire, they can just grind them slowly down into the ground. There's still going to be at least half of the player base who feel that they just should not exist inside the game. Now, I personally feel that artillery is a bit of a necessary evil. I think that, honestly, I know this is a bit of a meme in itself, but they do kind of prevent some vehicles with very good turrets from just sitting in open locations with impervious turrets. Now, is that a problem because Wargaming removed weak points from a lot of heavy tanks? If you think about way back, 8 or 10 years ago, most of the heavy tanks you could still penetrate if you knew about their weak point. Either it be the mouse's cheeks or the top bar on the E100. The IS-7 was a bit of a different one, but it didn't exactly have a really good gun, and it wasn't super fast like it is now. There are now vehicles like the Chieftain, like the IS-7, like the Object 279E that just feel they're fast enough to be able to rush into positions, and then when they're there, they're kind of impervious for the majority of tanks to be able to deal with. And for those players, yeah, the self-propelled gun is kind of the tank that keeps them in place. Or at least it's still not stopping those tanks from being balanced because they're already achieving incredibly good win ratios. But it means that it limits the positions that they can go into to be able to dominate the battle. And from that standpoint, I feel that the self-propelled gun is kind of this regulating class. It prevents a meta shifting to just being either completely hull down or god tier frontal armor. One thing I will say about self-propelled guns as well is that currently in the game, I feel that they end up stopping vehicles that might not have the thickest armor, but very well-angled armor as well. Think about kind of a Kranvang sitting on a ridgeline. Now, I know the Kranvang's got a really good turret, but it's actually got kind of like weak points on top of the vehicle. Think about a Stridsvagn 103B. When an STRV 103B is sitting in front of you, and you don't have a 121mm caliber gun or heat rounds, there's no real way that you can go through it apart from a very small weak point on top of the tank. But it's a real big, long vehicle with incredibly weak top armor, and self-propelled guns do keep them in check on ridgelines. Undoubtedly, artillery is the true nemesis of non-turreted tanks because they frequently track you, they frequently splash you, and with the stunning, if it's bad enough if you have a turret when you're stunned, let alone if you don't have a turret and you're stunned and now your traverse speed is that of a snail. Heavy tanks, medium tanks, light tanks. If they get tracked, at least they can still use their turret to fight back. Tanks like the T123 and the Badger, for example, after they've used that repair kit, unless they're kind of stacking up repair speed on their tank is what feels like has to become the meta on those super heavy vehicles, artillery can force them to use their repair kit and then allow their heavy tanks or their medium tanks to be able to push in. Now, that doesn't happen all the time, but all of you super heavy tank destroyers players out there will know just how frustrating it is when it happens. But also, it kind of stops the T123, it kind of stops the Badger, it stops the Jagdpanzer E100 as becoming one of the main picks inside the game. And so, the problem is that no matter what Wargaming do to artillery, 50% of the player base is going to think that it wasn't enough. Maybe 20% of the player base who actually really enjoy playing artillery are now going to hate them. And then there's probably kind of like the other 30% who are thinking like, I really don't like them, but they kind of still allow certain vehicles to not become dominant. So with that rather long forward into the fact that Wargaming have got a serious conundrum to be able to deal with here, let me present to you my opinion about the Sandbox test server, highlight what Wargaming have done, what they've done specifically well in my opinion, and what also possibly they have maybe overlooked or just not quite got right. Okay, so firstly, huge changes to the way that ammunition types are. If you've been staring right in the middle of the screen here, you will have seen that this T92 now has 3 types of ammunition, whereas previously it only had 2. Now, firstly, one of my favorite changes, no premium rounds. Artillery, shells cost the same pretty much throughout the board. The standard ammunition is 2,500. The would say usually premium ammunition, or should we say the round that was in the gold slot is now only costing 2,930. It's still a little bit more than the regular rounds on this vehicle, but that's not a lot more. And also you'll see that artillery has armor piercing shells back. Now, what's super important about these rounds is that one is designed to stun and to have a higher splash radius, while one is designed to do larger amounts of damage, but to have to sacrifice the splash radius. So I really like this. I like the idea that there are 3 different rounds for 3 different situations. And as long as Wargaming balance all of the rounds right, then they should still be useful, right? So let's talk about them. So let's talk about the first round here on the T92. This is high explosive with a splash as well. The damage is less. We can see that the average damage on this is 1,170. We can also see that the penetration is 60, which I believe is what the penetration currently is in the version of the game. The shell velocity is slightly slower, which actually means that the trajectory of the shell is going to be allowed to be higher. And it's got a big burst radius of 13 meters, and it will stun the target for 14 to 35 seconds before, of course, their modifiers are applied that reduce the stun time, preventing them from being able to fight back as effectively. It's pretty much a 25% penalty on the enemy vehicle with regards to everything that they can do. So they'll reload 25% longer, so on and so forth. They'll be 25% less accurate. They'll be able to turn much slower as well. Now Wargaming are adding in a new round, which is a high damage and higher penetration round. It has 1,430 average damage, as we can see here, and 90 millimeters of penetration. But its burst radius is pretty much going to be half of what the regular high explosive stunning round is. Now, you might be thinking, oh, does that mean they're only reducing the radius by half? That doesn't make a big deal. But remember that the area of a circle, I believe, is pi r squared, which actually means that that's kind of a 75% reduction in what the actual area of splash is going to be. Because, of course, if you take a circle that's this big, and then you half the radius, then it's going to go down to about this big, and you could fit like 4 of those circles in the other circle. That's why it's good to get the pizza that's only 2 inches bigger, because it's actually significantly more meaty, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe you haven't got meaty toppings on it. I digress. What you really need to know is that even though, you know, the burst radius doesn't look like it's that much smaller, let me tell you, it is. And it also makes me realize that artillery in its current form, even though you think you're only getting 1 extra meter in the splash radius when you fire the premium rounds, it is actually significantly higher damage because you're increasing that burst radius by a large amount. So really interesting here that Wargaming are effectively creating a shell which has higher penetration, roughly about 20% higher damage than the regular round, but it's going to have a much lower splash radius. So this is kind of coming back to what artillery more used to be, where they had to hit you. And also remember, this shell isn't going to stun you, so you won't have to use your med kit, and you will be able to fight back after you take the hit. So it's not fully back to what artillery kind of used to be, but it's definitely a step towards that direction with regards to their damage. Before I move on, I must actually clarify. You might be thinking, whoa, they're increasing the damage on, they're giving artillery a new shell and they're increasing the damage by 20%. There's something I must mention, And that is that if you look at the current damage that the T92 deals, it's actually 1,300 with the current splashing shell, which has a 30-meter explosive radius with 60 millimeters of penetration. And this, as we can see, is actually being reduced to 1,170. So that is a 10% nerf to artillery damage. If they want to keep using only the stun shell, they can play as they are now, but they're just going to do 10% less damage. And also there will be no ability for them to just use a premium round on the tank to increase their splash radius as they can currently do. So for all of those premium artillery players out there, the damage decrease is probably going to be more like 15 or even possibly 20% overall compared to what it is now, especially for those super large caliber, high explosive rounds. Of course, the artillery will be able to effectively do 10% more damage than they deal now, but to be able to achieve that, they're going to lose 75% of the burst area and all of the stunning effect as well. And there's no doubt, as I'm going to be showing you in the gameplay in a bit, that when artillery hits, it can hit really hard indeed on the Sandbox test server. But it will be a return to those kind of all or nothing hits where you either hit the tank and you do significant damage, or you don't if you choose to use those shell. The other thing that I must mention as well is that Wargaming have decided that if they want to use the high burst shell, that you're not actually going to be able to damage internal modules. That means no more fires if you're stunned as well by those high burst shells. And if you want to damage internal modules to the enemy vehicle, then they're going to have to use those shells with the lower burst radius and try and hit the tank directly, i.e. the high explosive, high damage shell. But that's not all. Wargaming are also bringing back armor-piercing shells to the self-propelled gun class, and these ones, they're like very lackluster in my opinion, but I'll explain them right from the get. Well, I'll explain them before I guess I've kind of like led with the conclusion. They are very lackluster. Let me explain why. Because they do 580 damage on a T92. What? Anyone who remembers the T92 back in the day, it was either doing like 1,800 or 2,200. I can't quite remember. All you really need to know is that it's doing 3 or 4 times less damage than it was dealing back in the day. That is tremendously less damage, almost to the point where there's no real use in using them, because frankly I've been hitting for more with my high damage, high explosive shells than I have with my armor piercing shells. But nevertheless, they do have 372 millimeters of average penetration. It's interesting here that Wargaming seem to have a mistake on the Sandbox test server with the way that they've written this, because it says 372 to 350, whereas the average is 372. So I'm very confused now. It says 372 millimeters of penetration here, but this doesn't make any sense. We're just going to go with 350 or 372. That's very good. It's the equivalent of a premium round from a tier 10 tank destroyer. That is going to reliably go in against heavy tanks if you hit them in the side. But more importantly, remember that there is the overmatch rule in World of Tanks. And that means that if the shell is over 3 times thicker in caliber than the thickness of the armor that it hits, that it will pretty much always go in, because it will penetrate up to 100 degrees of angled armor. So that means that this 240 millimeter chunky shell that's loaded on the T92, which I guess is like literally that wide, means that you are going to overmatch all 79 millimeter plates. There are a lot of 79 millimeter plates in World of Tanks, and so all you have to do is just hit the target anywhere against those thinly armored vehicles, and the shell is always going to go in. And when you think about it like that, 580 damage for a self-propelled gun does seem pretty nice indeed. Imagine that there's that medium tank towards the latter part of the game who's on about 400 hit points. If you can hit them flush, you will shut them down. If there's a light tank, I don't think there are many, if any, light tanks that are going to be able to avoid that shell towards the latter part of the game, so that should be very exciting. Remember, however, your gun is not very accurate, so good luck hitting those AP shells consistently. One thing that's really interesting for me is that I'd say on average, when I hit flush with the high explosive shell, I've been doing about 500 damage with the T92 with HE. My question is why would you use the AP then? Is that because the shell velocity is higher so that you can be more accurate against a moving target. It will still take you quite a while for that shell to be able to go through. The trajectory is also going to be much worse as well because the shell travels faster, so you can't loop it up as higher. I just feel that the armor-piercing rounds are very lackluster compared to the high damage, high explosive rounds, or the high explosive rounds as I'm just going to be calling them. I'm now going to refer to, from now on with the Sandbox test server, as those high damage, high explosive rounds as high explosive. And then I'm going to refer to the other ones as high explosive burst. And so, as it stands, while I like the idea that Wargaming would put an armor-piercing shell on an artillery, and maybe it will have some use, for example, going through walls, unless Wargaming decide to make those high explosive changes that they did in 2.0 earlier on, then your AP rounds will be able to go through a soft wall and still into the enemy target as well, which will be useful, or they'll go through trees, for example. So a lot of you might be thinking, well, how can you even possibly use all of these different kinds of shells when the reload times are often measured in 30 or 40 seconds for the high-tier self-propelled guns? It's not as if you can suddenly react to the situation and change shells. Well, this is where Wargaming are making a very cool change on this Sandbox test server. And that is, they've actually found a way to take the crew skill intuition, the way that it worked from the Crew 2.0 Sandbox test server, and incorporate it without all of the rest of the crew skills. This gives me massive hope that some of the better things from Crew 2.0 can be implemented into the game without necessarily making the ridiculous changes. Let's take the best features of Crew 2.0 Wargaming and put them into the game as it is to improve World of Tanks without making it pay to win, or just you have to play in a crazy amount of time to be able to have an insane advantage. Either way, Wargaming have basically managed to take intuition and the way that it works from Crew 2.0 and put it into the self-propelled gun Sandbox test server changes. And that is that if you are fully loaded and you switch shell types, that you are going to get a 60% reduction minimum on what your next shell will reload. And it's also affected by crew skills. And so if you're using a premium consumable, if you've got brothers in arms, if you're using vents, if you're using all of those things that bump it up a little bit, you can actually get to an 80% reduction in the shell reload. So I guess you could turn your 40-second reload down into an 8-second reload, and that might give you the time to be able to switch out to that armor-piercing round to be able to go after the enemy vehicle, or alternatively, maybe you want to just reload to have a nice big splash burst against multiple tanks. So that is all in all a vision of how Wargaming are suggesting that they want to change artillery inside the game. But that's not all. Wargaming are also giving tankers ways to be able to fight back against self-propelled guns. Firstly, with a new crew skill that is currently on the commander. And look, I just got to get my most important point out right now. Wargaming, what are you doing? Don't put this on the commander. Please, please, please. Commanders are already stressed enough as it is. There is a very specific class inside the game. Yeah, the radio operator, who has so many useless skills. Wargaming, please, 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 please. If you are going to, put sound detection on the radio operator or whatever crew member operates as the radio operator if they don't have a dedicated member doing so on the tank. Okay, now I've got my most important point out. Let me talk to you about what sound detection actually does. It is kind of like Sixth Sense, but only working against artillery shells. It indicates an enemy self-propelled gun shot. It gives you a little bit of a heads up to be able to either adjust the way that you're facing, to adjust where you are moving, or alternatively, it can allow you to pretty much pinpoint where the self-propelled gun shell is, even if they miss you and they don't splash you. And so then you can either ping the map to tell your light tanks where to go, or if you are a light tank, go over there and harass them. This is a massive change. To show you this in action, what better tank than, of course, the mouse? I'm on the Sandbox test server and we're about to get shot at by artillery. And watch, you're going to see the sound detection skill go off, and you'll see the artillery shell come. And I actually decide to stop because I thought maybe he was giving too much lead. And we get hit by the Conqueror gun carriage for only 87. Interestingly enough, that was actually a stun variant, or an HE stunning shell from the Conqueror gun carriage. Another thing that you might have noticed is just how much more visible all of the traces are of the self-propelled guns. Do you see them? And there's the sound detection going off again. you can literally see the self-propelled guns firing if you look closely. I'll see if I can pause one of the shell traces on so I can clarify what I'm saying. And there you go. Look how crystal clear that artillery shell is to be able to see. Now, you don't get a clear indication immediately of where the shell is. It looks like it takes maybe about 50 to 100 meters before the shell truly becomes, should we say, clear cut in where it's come from. But if it's literally going to allow everybody to tell where the self-propelled guns are. You are going to be able to tell their nests, you're going to be able to tell their firing locations, and as you can see, I'm pinging the map here, and I'm even going to try and blind fire to be able to catch the self-propelled guns as well. All in all, this is making artillery a huge amount more vulnerable, which I think is probably a good change. If the class is annoying the player base so much, I think giving players abilities to be able to have a feeling of fighting back or a feeling of defiance, you know, that sound detection ability might allow you to adjust your position or at least know and prepare yourself for the enemy's self-propelled gun. And so maybe you can adjust your planning of how you're going to deal with that heavy tank, how you're going to deal with the combat situation that you might find yourself in. If you know the artillery is firing at you and you get even a 1 or 2 second heads up warning about it, then you can start to adjust your subsequent plays about how you're going to go through the situation. More importantly, if you can see the shell traces so clearly from the enemy artillery, that is going to mean that you are going to be able to work within their reloads. And so if you see the traces from the enemy self-propelled guns, then you've got to figure out, well, at least I'm going to be safe for the next 30 or 40 seconds, right? And maybe you can make your moves. And so you don't have to be constantly looking at your team and looking at their hit points. And instead, you can literally just look for the traces. How amazing is that? Now, one thing I also want to highlight is you might be seeing something else on the minimap here. Look at this orange ring. And that is because there's a new option on the Sandbox test server so that you can change what kind of options you see. You'll notice that you can either turn on or turn off the arc for the enemy's self-propelled gun. I would always recommend to turn that on. Why wouldn't you? And then also there's this new option of where you can show on the minimap, even if you weren't there, where the artillery shell landed. And this will allow you to see on the minimap where the self-propelled gun has just hit, and then you're going to be able to figure out 2 important things. One, let's imagine that an enemy self-propelled gun, I don't know, managed to fire in this location here, just towards the east of where the AMX-50B would be. Well, that would suggest to me, because there's a bleeding great mountain in the way, that the self-propelled gun must be on the other side of the battlefield and up in the hills there to be able to get the opportunity to fire around the corner. So you will be able to, by knowing where artillery has fired, effectively, without seeing their shell tracer, pinpoint the location of where they are. And then apart from that, you're also going to be able to know when an artillery has fired, and so you can work within their reload. You can get a little bit of respite from the fact that you've known that Conqueror gun carriage or that T-92 has shot at the other flank, and at least you've got the next 30 seconds to possibly make a plan, make an attack, make that push, or push through a breach point to be able to feel safer. I think that's a fantastic change, and it will allow players to play more intelligently with better information at their disposal against the artillery, i.e. allow players to fight back against self-propelled guns, a class which undoubtedly 50% of the player base hate because they just have no way to really feel that sense of fighting back or defiance against just an onslaught of a class that can effectively just dictate the combat from a position where you can't fight them, i.e. on the other bloody side of the map. Now, without a shadow of a doubt, this makes artillery more vulnerable than ever. Most artillery players are probably already sweating when they see an EBR on the enemy team in the current version of the game, let alone if we see these Sandbox server changes come to fruition and Wargaming decide to implement them in the live version of the game. Imagine what an artillery player is going to be thinking when they see an EBR on the enemy team, but also every time they fire, they're literally pinpoint revealing their location to the enemy EBR. Now, whether or not Wargaming feel that this is going to make self-propelled guns too predictable on the battlefield and fast vehicles are going to be able to counter them too easily, we all know how unlikely it is, if you're a self-propelled gun player, that somebody on your team, hopefully the medium tanks, is going to try and prevent the light tanks from being able to get to you. But on the other hand, if this is what the majority of the player base wants, i.e. artillery to be more predictable on the battlefield and to have opportunities to be able to avoid their shells and get into their base and fight them, then it's probably what's got to happen. So undoubtedly, for all of you artillery haters out there, you might be thinking that this sounds like the best patch ever in World of Tanks. Artillery are going to be more vulnerable on the map than ever, and they're just flat out nerfing the damage that they will deal. Sure, they're going to be giving the new opportunities with regards to the high explosive rounds, the ones that deal more damage, and there is going to be armor piercing as well. But this is undoubtedly just a huge nerf to the class. The fact that they're just reducing the damage by 10%, allowing you to do 10% more damage than you already deal with a different kind of round that doesn't stun, and also has a 75% less burst radius, really won't increase the overall damage they deal, because artillery do miss a very large amount of the time, and a huge amount of the consistency in the self-propelled gun class has been that Wargaming changed the way that they work to dealing less damage but dealing it more consistently, because even if they miss, they're going to splash. Let's not forget also that they're removing the ability for the high explosive burst ammunition to be able to damage internal modules. Look, this is going to make me very popular with the artillery haters out there. And look, I think down in my heart, I am probably with you. But after playing on the Sandbox test server and playing artillery for about an hour or two, that it wasn't helped or compounded by the fact that the queue times were very high. I can tell you that artillery in this state, with being a lot more vulnerable with the positions, allowing the enemy light tanks or the medium tanks to adjust the way that they're traveling so you can't hit those real long-range bombshells on them because they've got sound detection. And the damage nerfs, it has all just compounded into... It's kind of got to the state where, why don't Wargaming just flat out remove the class if they're going to be this poor, they're going to be this useless. I feel like the changes to make artillery more vulnerable by allowing players to fight back against them with sound detection and seeing where they fire on the map and when they fire on the map and being able to push to harass them in their base and shut them down, it feels like it's more than enough. Maybe also the change to remove in taking internal damage from modules and only getting stunned will possibly be enough as well. But right now, as it is, I feel that these things in conjunction to just the flat out damage nerf is probably a little bit too much. I think personally, Wargaming, if they're going to do anything, they need to improve these armor piercing shells. There's really no point in using them apart from on certain tanks. Maybe Wargaming's idea is that T92s shouldn't have good armor piercing shells and their high explosive rounds should be better, whereas if you use the Object 261, maybe the AP will be better than the high explosive shells. If that's what they're thinking, okay, fine. But it's not that case for all of the self-propelled guns, and I think that you would be silly to use armor piercing shells on a vehicle such as the T92 and arguably most of the artillery when you're only dealing the same amount of damage that you would have dealt if you managed to hit or had a narrow miss with the high damage, high explosive shells, and those ones can also do internal damage with the way the HE damage calculations are calculated. My fear is that if Wargaming nerf artillery this much, we might see a resurgence in vehicles like the 279E, the Chieftain, people playing T110E3s. You know, those kind of vehicles that you just feel like you just can't do anything against frontally, and the whole joke is, well, just flank them, right? Or just group together with multiple buddies and be able to attack them at the same time. Yeah, it's nice when it happens in World of Tanks. It's absolutely wonderful to see an Object 279E get flanked by Tier 8 vehicles and for them to pump into the side of the tank. I get no more... There's hardly anything in World of Tanks that gives me more satisfaction than seeing that. But let's be honest, that requires coordination. And being able to achieve coordination in at least the majority of your battles, yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky thing. I'm very worried that if Wargaming continue to just nerf and nerf and nerf the self-propelled gun class, that it might get to a stage where they aren't able to dissuade some of the more heavily armored vehicles from sitting in positions where they just have a huge control over very important locations of the map, and they become the new meta. When I say they become the new meta, let's be honest, they kind of really feel like they are already the new meta. So to conclude, things that I love about the Sandbox test server. I love the new sound detection. I think that showing where artillery and when artillery fire is a necessary change to allow players to fight back against them. I love the fact that there's no pay-to-win shells on this class. I think that's the way that the game should be. And I really love the fact that Wargaming are implementing Crew 2.0 crew skills into the regular version of the game, showing that maybe we don't have to have all of the changes that we didn't like, and we just can have the good ones that will improve the game for the better. However, I still feel that maybe the damage nerf to high explosive shells, in conjunction with the inability for the high stun one, the burst radius one, to be able to damage internal modules, might be too much. My recommendation for Wargaming would be to either just all three of the rounds need to be buffed in a little way. Maybe just a 10% damage increase across the board. Maybe even a 20% damage increase on the armor-piercing shells. I mean, look at it like this. If your Jagdpanzer E100 dealt the 500 damage that it does on the T92, and you literally only fired 1.58 rounds a minute, and that's with Cola, that's with a Bond gun rammer, that's with Brothers in Arms, you wouldn't be very happy. In fact, if I work it out, artillery, if they penetrate all of their armor-piercing shells, are going to have, with a maxed out setup, about 800 damage per minute. And that's if they hit, and that's if they don't bounce. Yeah, the damage on the armor-piercing shells currently is laughable. Do we really want to reduce the self-propelled guns to having 800 damage per minute with the worst accuracy in the game just because they can fire further in a special arc than everyone else? I'm not sure it really needs to go that far. All in all, I think that this was actually my favorite Sandbox test server. I think that the artillery changes could be great for the game. But let's be honest, we can't have our cake and eat it, artillery haters. We can't know when they're firing at us. We can't know where they're firing on the map and work within their reloads. And also expect them to take a huge damage nerf at the same time. Or maybe we can, I don't know. In the end, you've got to make up your own mind. And hopefully we'll find a middle ground where the artillery haters and the artillery lovers will be happy. Anyway, that's it for today, ladies and gents. Really hope you enjoyed this one. I'll be very interested to hear what you all have to say in the comments down below. Do you think that the changes look fantastic? Which ones do you like? Which ones don't you like? Are you the kind of person who would love to see artillery removed from the game? Are you the kind of person who would love to see them nerfed into a point where there's no point in playing them in the game anymore? Or are you an artillery lover out there who see these changes? Which ones do you like? Which ones don't you like? Do you feel that your class deserves to do less damage than it's dealing now? Or do you feel that your class deserves to do more damage than it's dealing now? And as always, make sure you go on the Sandbox test server and have your say. There are some really good things that Wargaming have presented with the Sandbox test servers, and definitely some absolutely horrible things that they've presented. So if you want to see World of Tanks changed in the way that you think will be better for the longevity of the game and better for the breadth of the player base, then have your say now. There's never been a more important time. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you soon.